When we think of cults, our minds often drift to the well-known names: Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, the Manson family. But scattered across continents and hidden in remote corners of the world, there are groups far more obscure and just as disturbing. Tonight, we journey into the darkness of human nature, exploring cults that have largely escaped mainstream attention despite their horrific legacies. Deep in the Canadian wilderness during the late 1970s, a charismatic man with wild eyes and an even wilder sense of divine purpose began gathering followers to his side. His name was Roch Thériault, though he would later insist his disciples call him Moise, the French word for Moses. Born in 1947 in the Saguenay Valley of Quebec, Thériault was by all outward appearances an unremarkable man. He dropped out of school after 7th grade and drifted through a series of odd jobs, never quite finding his place in the world. His teachers had once praised his intellect, and that early validation seemed to plant a seed of grandiosity that would eventually bloom into something monstrous. Growing up in a devoutly Catholic household, Thériault developed an intense relationship with religion from an early age. His father, Hyacinthe, was involved with the White Berets, a Catholic sect that emerged after the Great Depression and advocated for the redistribution of social profits among the working class. This exposure to alternative religious thinking outside mainstream Catholicism would later influence the doctrines Thériault crafted for his own followers. From childhood, those who knew him noticed something different about him, a certain intensity in his gaze and a conviction in his voice that made people either want to follow him or stay far away. The community of Saguenay, which at that time lacked institutions for higher learning, offered limited opportunities for an ambitious young man. But Thériault's ambitions were never conventional. While his peers worked steady jobs and raised families, he was already dreaming of something greater, something that would set him apart from the ordinary world he found so stifling. In his 20s, Thériault developed stomach ulcers that required surgery. The complications and chronic pain that followed seemed to push him toward a desperate search for meaning. He became obsessed with the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its apocalyptic teachings, attending meetings regularly and absorbing their doctrines about health, clean living, and the approaching end times. The church's emphasis on vegetarianism, abstinence from alcohol, and preparation for Christ's return resonated with something deep within him. He began giving motivational speeches to small groups, speaking with an intensity that attracted those who were also searching for purpose. But Thériault's interpretations of Scripture grew increasingly extreme, and he pushed boundaries that even the Seventh-day Adventists, with their unorthodox beliefs, found troubling. In April 1978, the church formally expelled him. But by then, it was too late to contain what he had set in motion. He had already gathered a core group of devoted followers who saw in him something more than a preacher. They saw a prophet. By 1977, Thériault had begun attracting followers with his fiery speeches about the imminent end of the world. He spoke with such conviction that people actually believed him when he claimed God had revealed that civilization would end in February 1979. His charisma was undeniable. Former followers would later describe how he could make you feel like the most important person in the room, how his attention felt like a spotlight illuminating your very soul. He had a gift for identifying what people needed to hear and telling them exactly that. For some, it was the promise of community and belonging. For others, it was the certainty of knowing the future in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. And for a few, it was something darker, an attraction to his raw power and willingness to transgress every boundary that society had established. Thériault convinced his followers to abandon their families, sell their possessions, and follow him into the remote wilderness of Quebec. They established a commune on a mountainside he called Eternal Mountain, deep in the sparsely populated Gaspa Peninsula, where he promised they could be saved from the coming apocalypse. There, far from the prying eyes of authorities, Thériault's true nature began to emerge. He watched as his followers worked tirelessly to build shelter and prepare for the end times, comparing them to ants laboring in an anthill. The name stuck, and they became known as the Anthill Kids. What began as a community seeking spiritual salvation quickly devolved into a nightmare of totalitarian control. Thériault prohibited his followers from speaking to one another without his permission, effectively isolating each person even within the group. He renamed every member after figures from the Bible, taking complete ownership of their identities. He kept children separated from their parents in a communal children's house, and he impregnated every female member, eventually fathering 26 children. These women weren't his lovers in any meaningful sense. They were his property, required to submit to him as a religious obligation. When February 1979 came and went without the world ending, Thériault didn't lose his grip on his followers. Instead, his control tightened and his violence escalated. Minor infractions were punished with beatings using belts, hammers, or the flat side of an axe. Those who wished to leave were suspended from the ceiling, had their body hairs plucked one by one, or worse. Thériault would defecate on them as a form of humiliation. Members who failed to bring in enough money from selling baked goods were punished mercilessly. Over time, the punishments grew more extreme and more creative in their cruelty. He forced followers to break their own legs with sledgehammers, sit on lit stoves, and shoot each other in the shoulders. Children in the commune were sexually abused, held over fires, or nailed to trees while other children were ordered to throw stones at them. But perhaps nothing captured the horror of the Anthill Kids better than Thériault's delusions of medical prowess. Despite having no medical training whatsoever, he fancied himself a healer with divine surgical abilities. When a follower named Solange Boilard complained of a stomachache in 1989, Thériault decided to operate. With no anesthesia, he laid her naked on a table, punched her in the stomach, and then forced a plastic tube into her rectum to perform a crude enema with molasses and olive oil. When that didn't satisfy him, he cut open her abdomen with a knife and ripped out part of her intestines with his bare hands. He had another follower stitch her up with regular needle and thread. Boilard died the next day from the wounds he inflicted. But Thériault wasn't finished. Claiming he had the power of resurrection, he ordered his followers to saw open her skull so he could ejaculate onto her brain. When she failed to return to life, her body was buried in a shallow grave near the commune. Another follower, Gabrielle Lavallee, suffered under Thériault's hands for years. She had been burned on her genitals with a welding torch, had 8 of her teeth forcibly removed, and had a hypodermic needle broken off inside her spine. When she tried to escape once and was brought back, Thériault's punishment was severe. He used pliers to remove one of her fingers, nailed her hand to a table, and then amputated her entire arm with a hunting knife. It was Lavallee who finally brought down the Anthill Kids. In 1989, she fled the commune and contacted authorities, leading to Thériault's arrest for assault. His conviction allowed investigators to uncover the full scope of the horror, including Boilard's murder. Thériault was eventually sentenced to life in prison, But his story didn't end quietly. Even behind bars, he managed to father 4 more children during conjugal visits with devoted followers. It wasn't until February 2011 that his reign of terror truly ended, when his cellmate at Dorchester Penitentiary stabbed him to death. Near his body, authorities found a confession he had written that simply read, "You were right, I did it." While the world's attention was focused elsewhere as the new millennium approached, a very different kind of cult was preparing for the end of days in the hills of southwestern Uganda. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God had been building for over a decade, gathering thousands of followers who believed their leaders received direct messages from the Virgin Mary. Unlike many cults that operate in obscurity, this group had deep roots in the Catholic faith that dominated the region, making their eventual transformation into mass murderers all the more shocking. The movement arose during a period of intense religious fervor in East Africa. Throughout the 1980s, reports of Marian apparitions had spread across the region, most famously in Kibeho, Rwanda, where 7 seers claimed to receive visits from the Virgin Mary between 1981 and 1989. The Catholic Church ultimately approved some of these apparitions, lending credibility to a wave of mystical experiences that swept through Uganda and neighboring countries. For ordinary people facing the ravages of the AIDS epidemic, political instability, and grinding poverty, these apparitions offered hope and direct connection to the divine. The established church, many felt, had grown complacent and corrupt, its priests mired in scandal. A new movement that promised direct communication with the Virgin Mary represented something pure, something closer to the original faith their grandparents had practiced. The movement began in 1989 when a former prostitute and banana beer brewer named Credonia Morinde claimed she had experienced visions of the Virgin Mary in a cave near the town of Rwashamere. In these visions, she said, the Holy Mother warned that the world had strayed from God's commandments and that apocalyptic destruction was imminent. Morinde was not an obvious candidate for sainthood. Born in 1952, she had lived a rough life, running small businesses and cultivating a reputation as someone who knew how to get what she wanted. But those who met her after her alleged visions described a transformation. She spoke with absolute certainty about what the Virgin had told her, and that certainty was contagious. Around the same time, a failed politician and devout Catholic businessman named Joseph Kibwetir also claimed to be receiving divine revelations. Kibwetir, born in 1931, had spent years involved in Catholic lay organizations and local politics without achieving the prominence he felt he deserved. The visions gave him a new purpose and a new sense of importance. When Morinde approached Kibwetir with her visions, the two formed a partnership that would ultimately lead to one of the largest cult deaths in modern history. Kibwetir became the public face of the movement, eventually dressing in the robes of a Catholic bishop, while Morinde operated as the true power behind the scenes. Their message, delivered in area Catholic churches, resonated with disillusioned believers who felt the established church had lost its way. The group taught that the 10 Commandments had been distorted and needed to be restored to their original purity. They attracted several excommunicated priests and nuns who helped give their teachings a veneer of theological legitimacy. Among them was Father Dominic Katarababo, who had been ordained in the United States and brought an air of education and credibility to the group's leadership. By the late 1990s, the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments had swelled to approximately 5,000 members spread across several Ugandan towns. Their practices grew increasingly strict and strange. Members wore matching uniforms and were forbidden from speaking for fear of breaking the commandment against bearing false witness. They developed a sign language to communicate instead. Sexual activity was prohibited entirely. They ate only one meal on Fridays and Mondays. Medical care was forbidden, with Morinde claiming that the Virgin Mary had decreed it unnecessary. Members were required to sell all their possessions and turn over the proceeds to the church leadership, on the promise that the world would end with the new millennium. When January 1st, 2000 passed without incident, cracks began to appear in the group's unity. Members who had given everything they owned started demanding answers. Some wanted their money back. The leaders responded by setting a new date for the apocalypse, March 17th, 2000, when they promised the Virgin Mary would appear and transport all true believers to heaven. What happened on that day still haunts the people of Kanungu. On the morning of March 17th, locals reported that the movement held a massive celebration. Members roasted 3 bulls and drank 70 crates of soft drinks. There was singing and apparent joy. Then, with all the followers gathered inside their church, the doors and windows were nailed shut and boarded from the outside. Gasoline was doused throughout the building, and the structure was set ablaze. An estimated 530 people, including 78 children, burned to death inside. The screams could be heard from miles away. But the horror didn't end there. In the days that followed, police investigating the fire began searching other properties associated with the cult. What they found was even more disturbing than the inferno. At compounds throughout southwestern Uganda, they unearthed mass graves containing hundreds more bodies. Many showed signs of strangulation and poisoning. Unlike those who died in the fire, these victims had clearly been murdered over a period of weeks or months leading up to March 17th. Some investigators believe the leaders had been systematically eliminating anyone who questioned them or threatened to leave before staging the final apocalyptic spectacle. The final death toll reached approximately 780 people, surpassing even the infamous Jonestown massacre. The main perpetrators, including Morinde and Kibwetir, were never brought to justice. Their bodies were never conclusively identified among the dead, leading many to believe they escaped with the money they had collected from followers and may still be alive somewhere. A few weeks before the fire, a man identified as Father Dominic had purchased over 13 gallons of sulfuric acid from a local shop, telling the owner it was for batteries at a remote seminary. His body was never found either. Far from the tropical hills of Uganda, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, another nightmare was unfolding that would span decades and involve governments, dictators, and systematic torture on an industrial scale. In the remote countryside of central Chile, approximately 340 kilometers south of Santiago, a community of German immigrants had established what appeared to be an idyllic farming settlement. They called it Colonia Dignidad, meaning colony of dignity, and for years the outside world knew it only as a charitable organization that provided free education and health care to local families. The local children who attended the colony's school learned German songs and received medical care at the colony's hospital. The colonists themselves were known for their impressive work ethic, their spotless facilities, and their Germanic efficiency. What no one outside the barbed wire fences knew was that behind this facade of respectability lay one of the most sophisticated systems of abuse ever devised. The man at the center of this colony was Paul Schaefer, a German preacher born in 1921 who had once served as a medic in the Hitler Youth during World War II. The war years had shaped Schaefer in ways that would manifest throughout his life. He learned the power of hierarchy, the effectiveness of rigid discipline, and the ease with which atrocities could be hidden from the outside world when everyone within a closed system was implicated. After the war, Schaefer worked as a welfare worker for children at a local church in Germany, a position that gave him access to vulnerable young people. He was fired from that position at the end of the 1940s amid accusations of sexually abusing the children in his care. But the post-war chaos of Germany made it easy for him to move to a new community and start again. Each time accusations caught up with him, he simply relocated and resumed his activities. Undeterred by mounting evidence against him, Schaefer continued building a following, establishing a youth home and recruiting devoted followers with his charismatic preaching. He told them that he had been chosen by God to lead a purified community away from the corruption of modern society. His followers believed him. By the late 1950s, German authorities were closing in on him again for child molestation charges. Rather than face justice, Schaefer fled Europe entirely. In 1961, Schaefer surfaced in Chile, where the conservative government of President Jorge Alessandri granted him permission to establish a charitable society. Using funds collected from his German congregation, Schaefer purchased a 400-acre ranch in a remote area near the town of Parral. Over the next few years, approximately 300 German followers immigrated to Chile in waves, establishing what would become one of the most tightly controlled cult compounds in history. Schaefer may have been influenced by the prophecies of William Branham, who repeatedly predicted imminent nuclear war that would devastate Western nations. South America seemed like a safe haven. What the colonists found upon arrival was not a religious utopia, but a prison camp. The compound was surrounded by barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and searchlights. Schaefer implemented a system of total control that he himself would later claim was even more perfect than Nazi Germany, because unlike the Third Reich, he achieved 100% participation from his followers. Those who resisted were broken through beatings and torture until they fell in line. Members were forbidden from marrying or having romantic relationships, though this did not apply to Schaefer himself, who used his position to prey upon the children of the colony. The children of Colonia Dignidad were separated from their parents and raised communally in a children's house where Schaefer had unfettered access to them. Former residents later testified that the abuse began at a young age and continued throughout childhood. Boys were particularly targeted, though no child was truly safe. To keep the colonists compliant, Schaefer implemented a system of psychological control that included mandatory medication. Residents were told they had epilepsy or schizophrenia and were given drugs daily that investigators later determined were designed to suppress their free will. They worked from sunrise to sunset without complaint, accepting torture and beatings as normal. The colony sustained itself through agriculture and legitimate businesses, but it also concealed darker enterprises. After Augusto Pinochet seized power in Chile in 1973 through a military coup, Colonia Dignidad became a secret detention center for the dictator's security forces. Political dissidents who opposed the regime were brought to the colony, where they were tortured using methods taught by former members of the SS and Gestapo. Many were killed and buried in unmarked graves on the property. In exchange for these services, Pinochet visited Schaefer personally in 1974, and the colony received special privileges, including the right to mine for gold and uranium. They were also granted immunity from government oversight. The full scope of the crimes at Colonia Dignidad only began to emerge after Chile's return to democracy in 1990. In 1997, 2 young boys managed to escape and flee to the German embassy, finally revealing the systematic abuse that had continued for decades. Schaefer went into hiding, eventually fleeing to Argentina with the help of his network. It took until 2005 for authorities to track him down and arrest him. He was extradited back to Chile, convicted of child abuse, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died behind bars in 2010 at the age of 88, having never shown remorse for his crimes. The German government's complicity in the colony's horrors remained a source of shame for decades. German diplomats had visited the colony and declared suspicions unfounded, even as evidence mounted. It wasn't until 2017 that the German Bundestag formally acknowledged the country's failure to protect its citizens and passed a resolution calling for investigations, memorials, and compensation for survivors. By then, an entire generation had been robbed of their childhoods and their freedom by a man who used religion as a weapon of control. Across the border in Mexico and extending into the American Southwest, another religious leader was orchestrating a different kind of horror. His name was Ervil LeBaron, and he would come to be known as the Mormon Manson for the string of murders he ordered across 2 decades. Unlike most cult leaders who exploit their followers for money or sex, LeBaron used his position to eliminate rivals and dissenters through a twisted interpretation of an old Mormon doctrine called blood atonement. His story is one of family dynasties, religious schisms, and the ease with which faith can be weaponized for violence. The LeBaron family had deep roots in Mormon fundamentalism, stretching back generations to the earliest days of the Latter-day Saint movement. Ervil's great-great-grandfather, Benjamin F. Johnson, was one of the original followers of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. When the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially abandoned polygamy in 1890 under pressure from the U.S. government, Johnson and his descendants refused to give up what they considered a sacred covenant with God. They became part of a movement of fundamentalist Mormons who believed the mainstream church had betrayed its divine mandate by caving to secular authority. Ervil's grandfather moved the family to Mexico, where the practice of plural marriage could continue without interference from American law. Ervil was born in 1925 into this isolated community, raised with the understanding that plural marriage was not just permitted, but divinely mandated. His father, Aum LeBaron Sr., believed that Benjamin Johnson had appointed him as Joseph Smith's rightful successor, giving the family a sense of divine destiny that set them apart even from other fundamentalist communities. This belief in their special status permeated every aspect of the children's upbringing. Ervil grew up believing he was part of a chosen bloodline, destined for religious leadership. He eventually took 13 wives, some of whom were underage when he married them, and fathered at least 50 children. The sheer size of his family would later provide him with an army of loyal executioners who carried out his commands without question. In the 1960s, LeBaron's older brother Joel founded the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times, a fundamentalist Mormon sect based in Baja California. Ervil served as second in command, holding authority over a Mexican settlement called Colonia LeBaron. But tensions between the brothers grew as Ervil began advocating for something Joel rejected: the return of blood atonement. According to this doctrine, certain sinners must have their blood shed in order to earn a place in heaven. In effect, it required a death penalty administered by the faithful. Joel wanted nothing to do with it. By 1972, The rift between the brothers had become irreconcilable. Ervil broke away and founded his own sect, the Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God. He proclaimed himself not merely a prophet, but the rightful leader of all polygamous Mormon sects, entitled to their tithes and their obedience. Those who refused to acknowledge his authority were marked for death. That same year, Ervil ordered his followers to murder Joel. His brother was beaten and shot to death in Mexico, becoming the first but far from the last victim of Ervil's divine vengeance. What made Ervil LeBaron particularly dangerous was his ability to convince others to kill on his behalf. He never pulled the trigger himself. Instead, he persuaded his wives, children, and devoted followers that they would be doing God's will by eliminating his enemies. The targets were not limited to rival religious leaders. Ervil also ordered the murders of family members who tried to leave the cult and followers who questioned his authority. His own 17-year-old daughter, Rebecca, pregnant with her second child, was allegedly strangled in 1977 for expressing a desire to leave the group. In April 1975, Ervil ordered the killing of Bob Simons, a polygamist who sought to minister to Native Americans. In 1977, he targeted Dr. Rulon Allred, the leader of another large polygamous sect called the Apostolic United Brethren. Two women wearing disguises and red wigs entered Allred's medical practice in Salt Lake City and shot him to death. The killers were traced back to Ervil's church. One of them was Rena Chenoweth, Ervil's youngest wife. Ervil was eventually arrested in Mexico and extradited to the United States, where he was convicted of ordering Allred's murder in 1980. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Utah State Prison. But even from behind bars, Ervil continued to exert control over his followers. He spent his time writing a 400-page manifesto called the Book of the New Covenants, which included a hit list of enemies who deserved to die. Copies were distributed to his most devoted disciples. When Ervil died of apparent heart failure in his cell in 1981, his influence did not die with him. On June 27, 1988, at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, followers of the Church of the Lamb of God carried out simultaneous assassinations in 3 different locations across Texas. The victims were all people named in Ervil's book, his stepson Eddie Marston, former followers Mark and Dwayne Chenoweth, and Dwayne's 8-year-old daughter, Jennifer. The coordinated timing was meant as a message that Ervil's reach extended beyond the grave. Arrests and prosecutions followed over the next several years, with some cult members apprehended as late as 2011. The violence that began with one man's lust for power and twisted interpretation of Scripture left a trail of at least 25 dead across 2 countries and 3 decades. In the dense Amazon rainforest of Brazil, far from the religious conflicts of North America, yet another group was forming around beliefs that would lead to unspeakable crimes against children. The Superior Universal Alignment, founded in 1981 by a woman named Valentina de Andrade in the town of Carazinho, Rio Grande do Sul, preached that she had been contacted by extraterrestrial beings who warned her about humanity's impending doom. According to de Andrade, the Christian God was a fabrication, a cosmic scam perpetrated on humanity to keep them docile and obedient. Jesus Christ, she taught, was actually an alien sent to Earth to promote love and enlightenment. But his message had been corrupted by those who created the false religion of Christianity. These extraterrestrial beings promised to send a spaceship to collect all of her followers before the apocalypse destroyed the rest of humanity, but only if they spread the word and followed her teachings with absolute devotion. De Andrade attracted followers from across Brazil and neighboring countries, building a network that included professionals, business people, and even law enforcement officers. Her teachings had a veneer of New Age spirituality that appealed to those dissatisfied with traditional religion, but seeking something more than secular materialism. She published books explaining her philosophy, including one titled God, the Great Scam, which laid out her beliefs in detail. But central to De Andrade's doctrine was a particularly disturbing belief about children, one that would eventually lead to horrific violence. She taught that all male children born after 1981 were incarnations of evil, unconscious instruments of a false god who meant to corrupt humanity. In God, the Great Scam, she warned her followers to be cautious around children and to pay special attention to those born after that pivotal year. The children, she insisted, were violent by nature and represented a threat to the enlightened who had accepted her teachings. This belief system created a moral framework in which harming children could be justified, even mandated, as a form of spiritual protection. The consequences would be devastating. The cult established a significant presence in Altamira, a remote town in the Para state of northern Brazil, deep in the Amazon region. Altamira was a frontier town, a place where institutions were weak and the rule of law often broke down. It was the kind of place where outsiders could operate without much scrutiny, where poverty made people vulnerable to exploitation, and where crimes could go uninvestigated for years. Beginning in 1989, children in and around Altamira began disappearing. At first, the disappearances were explained away as runaways or accidents in the dangerous wilderness that surrounded the town. The local police, underfunded and understaffed, did not devote significant resources to finding the missing boys. By 1993, the reports had risen to 19 missing children, all boys between the ages of 8 and 14, with no trace or clue to find them. 5 were eventually found dead, their bodies showing signs of torture, sexual violence, and surgical mutilation. Most disturbingly, they had been castrated with what appeared to be professional precision, leading investigators to believe that medical professionals were involved. The case broke open when a survivor emerged. A boy who had escaped from captivity identified his captors, and his testimony shocked Brazilian society. Among those he named were 2 doctors, a wealthy businessman, a police officer, and the leader of a religious cult. All were respected members of their community who had used their positions to shield themselves from suspicion. Dr. Anicio Ferreira de Sousa and Dr. Cecílio Brandão were accused of performing the mutilations, using their medical expertise in service of the cult's twisted ideology. The wealthy businessman Amalton Madeira Gomes and his father Jose were implicated for financing and benefiting from the rituals. A military policeman provided protection for the group. The trial was plagued by delays, contradictions, and accusations of corruption. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence went missing. The judicial process dragged on for a decade. In 2003, 3 of the main defendants were finally convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 35 to 77 years. But Valentina de Andrade, the woman whose teachings had inspired the killings, was acquitted. Her defense team presented an alibi claiming she was not in Altamira when the murders occurred. She walked free and continues to this day to lead her followers. The case was further complicated when, years later, authorities arrested Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito, a serial killer who confessed to 42 murders of children, including 12 in Altamira. His confession cast doubt on the judicial outcome and raised questions about how many perpetrators were actually involved in the years of terror that gripped the Amazon town. The truth may never be fully known, but what remains clear is that children were systematically targeted, tortured, and killed based on the beliefs of a cult that viewed them as embodiments of cosmic evil. In the autumn of 1994, the European continent experienced a shock that seemed to come from nowhere. Within a span of just a few days, 53 members of a secretive organization called the Order of the Solar Temple were found dead in Switzerland and Canada. Their bodies were arranged in ritual formations, some in the shape of a star, others in circles. Many wore ceremonial robes of red, white, and black, the colors of alchemical transformation. The buildings where they died had been deliberately set ablaze, the fires timed to consume the evidence even as they released the members' souls to their cosmic destination. For a continent that had long felt insulated from American-style cult violence, the Solar Temple deaths shattered any illusion of safety. If this could happen in Switzerland, one of the most orderly and prosperous nations on Earth, it could happen anywhere. The Order of the Solar Temple traced its lineage to various Neo-Templar movements that had emerged after the French Revolution, claiming descent from the medieval Knights Templar who were suppressed by the Pope in the 14th century. The original Templars had been warrior monks who protected Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land during the Crusades. When King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, conspired with Pope Clement V to destroy them. In 1307, the Templars were accused of heresy, sodomy, and worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet. Many were tortured and burned at the stake. But legends persisted that some had escaped, carrying with them secret knowledge and treasures that had been passed down through hidden societies ever since. This mythology of secret wisdom, persecution, and eventual vindication proved irresistible to certain spiritual seekers throughout the centuries. But the modern incarnation of the group was founded in Geneva in 1984 by two men whose ambitions were more cosmic than historical. Joseph de Mombreau, a French jeweler and esotericist with a history of fraud, had spent years founding and leading various occult organizations before landing on the formula that would become the Solar Temple. De Mombreau was not a charismatic public speaker. He was manipulative, controlling, and convinced of his own spiritual importance. He claimed to be the reincarnation of various historical figures and believed he had a direct connection to ascended masters who guided humanity's spiritual evolution. Luc Jouret, a Belgian homeopathic physician known for lectures on alternative medicine and spirituality, served as the public face and chief recruiter for the organization. Jouret was everything de Mombreau was not: handsome, articulate, and capable of filling lecture halls with seekers eager to hear his message about humanity's cosmic destiny. Together, they made a formidable team. What made the Solar Temple different from many other cults was the profile of its members. These were not the downtrodden or desperate. The group attracted wealthy professionals, successful business people, and prominent citizens. Robert Ostegui was the mayor of Richelieu, Quebec. Camille Pilet had been a designer watch salesman for Piaget. Robert Falardeau was a Canadian government official. Patrick Voirnet was the son of Olympic skiing champion Jean Voirnet. The members paid substantial fees for initiations and rituals, funding an organization whose leaders lived lavishly while preaching spiritual enlightenment. At the core of Solar Temple beliefs was a conviction that Earth would face worldwide catastrophe in the mid-1990s. Members believed that through ritual death, they could transit to a higher plane of existence, traveling spiritually to the star Sirius, where they would live on in transformed bodies of light. This was not presented as suicide, but as a passage, a glorious departure from a doomed world to a celestial paradise. DiMambro orchestrated elaborate ceremonies using hallucinogenic drugs, special lighting effects, and atmospheric music to reinforce these beliefs. By the early 1990s, the organization was beginning to fracture. Several scandals had emerged, including attempted illegal weapon purchases and money troubles. Some members were losing faith. DiMambro was aging and in poor health. Internal documents would later reveal that he and Jure had been planning what they called the transit for some time, seeing it as both a spiritual culmination and an escape from mounting problems. The violence began on September 30th, 1994, at a chalet in Maureen Heights, Quebec. A couple named Tony and Nikki Dutoit, along with their 3-month-old son, Emmanuel, were murdered in what investigators later learned was a ritual killing. Tony was beaten over the head, had his throat slashed from ear to ear, and was stabbed 50 times. Nikki was stabbed repeatedly in the back, throat, and breasts. The baby had been stabbed multiple times through the chest. According to DiMambro's twisted theology, the child was the Antichrist, an enemy sent to destroy the group from within. 5 days later, on October 4th and 5th, the coordinated deaths began. In Cherry, Switzerland, 23 bodies were found in a burned-out farmhouse, arranged in a circle facing a central altar. 25 more bodies were discovered in 3 ski chalets in Salvan, another Swiss village. Many had been shot or drugged before being consumed by fire. Among the dead were DiMambro and Jure themselves, along with their closest followers. But not everyone died willingly. Autopsies revealed that several victims showed signs of struggle, suggesting they were murdered rather than willing participants in a mass suicide. Before the fires, 4 letters known as the Testament were sent to various recipients explaining the group's beliefs and intentions. The letters described the act not as suicide, but as a noble passage, declaring that the members would acquire solar bodies and live eternally on Sirius. They also mentioned that certain traitors had been executed, apparently referring to the Dutoit family and others who had fallen out of favor. The Solar Temple deaths did not end in 1994. On December 23, 1995, another 16 members were found dead near Grenoble, France, their bodies arranged in a star formation on a hillside. And on March 22, 1997, 5 more bodies were discovered in a house in Saint-Casimir, Quebec. Among those who died in Quebec were 3 adults and 2 teenagers. Remarkably, 3 younger children who had been given the choice to participate had declined and were drugged during the ritual so they would survive. They remain the only known survivors of a solar temple transit. In total, 74 people died across the 3 waves of mass death, making the Solar Temple one of the deadliest cults in recent history. On the other side of the world, in the Orderly Society of Japan, another group was preparing for a different kind of apocalypse. Aum Shinrikyo, founded by a partially blind former yoga instructor named Shoko Asahara, would become the first and only terrorist organization to successfully deploy chemical weapons in a major urban attack. The story of how a small meditation group transformed into a doomsday cult capable of mass murder stands as one of the most disturbing cult narratives of the 20th century. It raises troubling questions about how modern societies produce alienation, how intelligent people can be led to commit atrocities, and how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. Japan in the 1980s and early 1990s presented a paradox. The country was wealthy, technologically advanced, and remarkably safe. Violent crime was rare, the trains ran on time, and social harmony was prized above individual expression. Yet beneath this orderly surface, many young people felt profoundly disconnected. The pressure of Japan's education system, often called examination hell, sorted students into winners and losers from an early age. Those who succeeded faced lifelong employment in corporate structures that demanded total conformity. Those who failed were relegated to the margins of a society that offered few second chances. For some, this environment created a hunger for meaning that mainstream religion, with its formulaic rituals and empty ceremonies, could not satisfy. They were searching for something more intense, more real, more demanding of their total commitment. Asahara, born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955, grew up in poverty as one of 7 children in a family of tatami mat makers in Kumamoto Prefecture. He was afflicted with infantile glaucoma that left him completely blind in one eye and partially blind in the other. This disability shaped his entire life. Sent to a government-subsidized school for the blind at age 6, he would never live with his family again. The school became his world, and within that world, his partial sight made him a king among those who could not see at all. He learned early how to manipulate others for profit by guiding them to shops in exchange for payment. Former classmates would later describe him as a bully who used his advantages ruthlessly, extracting fees from those who depended on him while dreaming of greater power. He told schoolmates that his ambition was to become Prime Minister of Japan, ruling over a society that had cast him out. He developed grandiose fantasies about commanding a kingdom of intelligent robots who would obey his every command. After graduating, Asahara tried to gain admission to medical school, but was rejected. He turned to acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, eventually opening a pharmacy that specialized in herbal remedies. In 1982, he was arrested for selling fake cures and convicted of fraud. The humiliation destroyed his business and plunged him into depression. But by 1984, he had discovered a new path: spirituality. He began practicing yoga and meditation, studied with various new religious movements, and claimed to have achieved enlightenment during pilgrimages to India. In 1987, Asahara officially founded Aum Shinrikyo, a name meaning supreme truth. The group blended elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity, with apocalyptic prophecies drawn from Nostradamus and the Book of Revelation. Asahara claimed to be Christ, the Lamb of God, and the only fully enlightened master in Japan. He predicted that a third world war was imminent, instigated by the United States, which he called the Beast. His followers would be the chosen survivors who would rebuild civilization after Armageddon. What made Aum Shinrikyo unusual was its ability to attract highly educated members. University graduates, scientists, computer programmers, and even government officials joined the ranks. At its peak, the group had tens of thousands of members in Japan and Russia, and smaller followings in other countries. Members submitted to extreme austerities at compounds near Mount Fuji, where Asahara sold vials of his own bodily fluids at high prices, claiming they would transfer spiritual powers. Followers meditated for hours while wearing electronic headgear designed to synchronize their brain waves with the masters. As the 1990s The group was implicated in the murder of an anti-cult lawyer named Tsutsumi Sakamoto, along with his wife and infant son, who disappeared in 1989 after Sakamoto began investigating the organization. In 1990, Asahara ran candidates for the Japanese Diet, but all were soundly defeated. The political failure seems to have accelerated his turn toward violence as a means of achieving his apocalyptic vision. Under Asahara's direction, Aum began developing chemical and biological weapons. They attempted to culture anthrax and even tried to obtain samples of the Ebola virus from Africa at a facility called Satyan 7, designed to look like a shrine to the Hindu god Shiva. Cult scientists manufactured sarin, a deadly nerve agent originally developed by Nazi Germany. In June 1994, they carried out their first major attack in the city of Matsumoto, releasing sarin from a truck that killed 8 people and injured hundreds. The attack was meant to target judges ruling against the cult in a lawsuit, but police initially suspected an innocent local resident and failed to connect the crime to Aum. Emboldened by their success and aware that authorities were beginning to close in, Asahara ordered a larger attack. On the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 Aum members boarded separate subway trains on 3 of Tokyo's busiest lines during the rush hour commute. Each carried plastic bags filled with liquid sarin concealed in newspaper. Using sharpened umbrella tips, they punctured the bags and fled the trains, leaving the deadly gas to evaporate and spread through the cars and stations. The attack killed 14 people and injured nearly 6,000 more, overwhelming Tokyo's hospitals and emergency services. Police raids on Aum facilities in the weeks that followed revealed the full scope of Asahara's ambitions. They found chemical manufacturing equipment, stockpiles of weapons, plans for future attacks, and evidence of past murders. Asahara himself was discovered hiding in a tiny concealed room at the cult's headquarters, surrounded by bottles containing samples of his own hair. He was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the sarin attacks and the Sakamoto family murders. The trial dragged on for years, complicated by Asahara's refusal to cooperate and claims of mental incompetence. He was eventually convicted of masterminding the attacks and sentenced to death in 2004. After exhausting all appeals, Shoko Asahara and 6 other Aum members were executed by hanging on July 6, 2018. 6 more were executed later that month. Though the cult officially disbanded and reorganized under new names, Japanese security agencies continue to monitor successor groups to this day, warning that the threat has not entirely disappeared. In the verdant hills outside Melbourne, Australia, another cult was operating with a very different mission. The woman who led it believed she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and she was building a master race of children to survive the coming apocalypse. Her name was Anne Hamilton Byrne, and the organization she founded, known simply as The Family, would leave scars on a generation of children who grew up believing they were siblings preparing for the end of the world. Australia seemed like an unlikely setting for such horrors, a prosperous nation with strong social services and a generally secular culture. But the family demonstrated that evil can flourish anywhere when the right combination of charisma, wealth, and isolation comes together. Hamilton Byrne was born Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards on December 30th, 1921, in the Victorian town of Sale. Her early life was marked by instability and trauma that would shape her later quest for power and control. Her father, Ralph, was a World War I veteran who was often absent, leaving the family to struggle economically. Her mother, Florence, a British-born woman, claimed to communicate with the dead and was repeatedly hospitalized for mental illness. The household was chaotic and unpredictable, with Florence's episodes creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Evelyn spent part of her childhood in an orphanage, separated from her parents during her mother's hospitalizations. These early experiences of abandonment and institutional care would later inform her own treatment of children, though in ways that were cruel rather than compassionate. After her first husband, Lionel Harris, died in a car accident in 1955, Evelyn experienced what she called a spiritual awakening. Grief opened a door in her psyche that had previously been closed. She began exploring alternative spirituality, changing her name to Anne Hamilton as part of her transformation. She studied yoga and began teaching classes in Melbourne, where her beauty, charisma, and confident declarations of spiritual truth attracted devoted followers. Unlike many cult leaders who emerged from poverty or obscurity, Hamilton Byrne cultivated an image of glamour and sophistication. She dressed in fine clothes, wore expensive jewelry, and presented herself as a woman of refinement who had access to secret wisdom unavailable to ordinary people. This image was carefully constructed and maintained, hiding the humble and troubled origins that might have undermined her claims to divine status. By the mid-1960s, Hamilton Byrne had formalized her teachings and established an organization she called Santiniketan Park Association, though it would become universally known as the Family. Her doctrine blended Christianity, Hinduism, and various Eastern religions with her own claims of divinity. She told followers that she was Christ returned to earth, and that Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna had all been enlightened beings who came to guide humanity. Hamilton Byrne placed herself in the same category as these divine teachers. The Family attracted professionals, doctors, nurses, lawyers, and scientists who were seeking spiritual meaning in the materialism of modern Australia. One of her earliest and most important converts was Dr. Raynor Johnson, a physicist who became enthralled by her teachings and helped recruit others from Melbourne's educated elite. The cult operated quietly, following a motto of being unseen, unheard, and unknown. Members kept their day jobs and lived normal public lives while gathering weekly at Hamilton Byrne's lodge to worship their living goddess. A key tool of control within the Family was the hallucinogenic drug LSD. During the 1960s and 1970s, a private psychiatric hospital called New Haven, owned by a cult member, was used to recruit new followers and reinforce the beliefs of existing ones. Patients at the hospital were treated with LSD and electroconvulsive therapy, sometimes against their will, and cult psychiatrists used these methods to break down resistance and build devotion. Hamilton Byrne administered LSD to her adult followers as a sacrament, convincing them that the visions they experienced proved her divine nature. But the most disturbing aspect of the Family was what happened to the children. Beginning in the early 1970s, Hamilton Byrne began collecting children to raise as her own. Some were the biological offspring of cult members who surrendered their babies at birth. Others were illegally adopted through the network of doctors and lawyers who belonged to the group. In total, approximately 28 children were gathered and taken to a remote property called Uptop, near Lake Eildon, about 3 hours from Melbourne. At Uptop, the children were isolated from the outside world and told that Anne and Bill Hamilton Byrne, whom Anne had married in 1978, were their biological parents. They believed they were all brothers and sisters. To reinforce this illusion, their hair was bleached blonde and they were dressed in matching outfits. The children were homeschooled on the property and forbidden from contact with the outside world, They knew the other adults in the group only as aunties and uncles. The discipline at up top was harsh and often cruel. Children were subjected to starvation diets, beaten for minor infractions, and given doses of psychiatric medications to keep them docile. The women who cared for them, the aunties, followed Hamilton Burns' instructions with rigid obedience. When Anne was away traveling, which was often, she would call and listen over the phone while the aunties disciplined the children. The beatings were administered not out of immediate anger, but as a matter of routine control. When the children reached adolescence, they underwent an initiation ceremony involving LSD. They were given large doses of the drug and left alone in a dark room, isolated except for periodic visits from Hamilton Burn or cult psychiatrists. The experiences were terrifying and disorienting, designed to bond them permanently to the cult and convince them of Anne's spiritual power. Some children received multiple doses over a period of days. The psychological trauma would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The cult began to unravel in the late 1980s when one of the children, a teenage girl, escaped from up top and went to authorities. On August 14, 1987, police raided the compound and removed all the children from the premises. What they discovered confirmed years of rumors and suspicions. The children had no birth certificates. They had been taught to lie about their identities. Many had psychological problems and developmental delays from their years of isolation and abuse. The investigation that followed spanned continents and took years. Hamilton Burn and her husband fled Australia and were eventually found living in the Catskill Mountains of New York in 1993. They were extradited back to Australia and charged with conspiracy to defraud and commit perjury in relation to the adoption scams. But the charges were relatively minor, and no one was ever prosecuted for the child abuse itself. Prosecutors expressed concern that the now adult children would not be able to testify effectively about their experiences. Anne Hamilton Burn was convicted of fraud and fined just 5,000 Australian dollars. She was diagnosed with dementia in her later years and died on June 13, 2019, at the age of 97, having never shown remorse or acknowledged wrongdoing. The children she raised in captivity have scattered across the world, some speaking publicly about their experiences, others trying to forget. At least one, Sarah Hamilton Burn, died in 2016 at the age of 46, a victim of the trauma she endured. The family stands as a stark reminder that cults can flourish even in prosperous, educated societies, and that the wounds they inflict can last a lifetime. These are the stories that don't make the history books. The leaders who convinced ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. The followers who gave up everything, including their children, their bodies, and their lives, in service of beliefs that seem incomprehensible to outsiders. The cults you've never heard of operated in the shadows, protected by isolation, money, or the simple fact that no one was looking for them. If there is any lesson to draw from these dark chapters of human history, it is that the capacity for both faith and horror lives within us all, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Thank you for listening tonight. If you found this journey into the unknown compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden stories to light. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that the truth is often stranger and more disturbing than any fiction.